Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. We are discussing the life and the legacy of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, passed last week due to complications from pancreatic cancer. Justice Bader Ginsburg was a titan of a woman, a towering figure, though small in stature, and she leaves behind a great legacy and advocacy for the rights of all people. And as President Clinton said in his remarks, as a means in which to honor her and her passing, he said that she helped to make our nation a more perfect union. And so we found it fitting tonight to talk about that legacy and what Justice Ginsburg meant to the court, talk some about her life and how that shaped her to be the woman who she ultimately became. We'll talk about the long shadow that she cast in the law, and then we'll also talk about the race and the moment to replace her. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed Executive Director, Jacob Bender.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here for this event, though still touched and tinged with a great amount of sadness, also with anger at looking at how the Republican Party and the Trump administration are following her passing with their own machinations. This is another one of CAIR-Philadelphia's webinars brought to you by the Philadelphia chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. CAIR is the largest and most preeminent Muslim civil rights organization in the country, with 33 chapters spread over the United States. The goal of CAIR is to something Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have agreed with. The goal of CAIR is to protect the civil liberties of American Muslims that are these days under attack, as are the civil liberties of many, many marginalized groups in this society. So, Tim, I'd like to start it out. And what about her personal narrative do you think led to the person she became in later years of her life?
That's a good question, Jacob. So Justice Ginsburg was raised in Brooklyn, and shortly before her high school graduation, her mother passed away. And her mother was a central figure in her life. It was someone that she loved dearly and was inspirational to her. And like Justice Ginsburg, her mother was a gifted student, but her mother had to stall or postpone her post-secondary education to fund her brother's education, because that's the thing that was done at the time. And so when Justice Ginsburg's mother passed away, one of the things that she decided to do, or was inspired to do, was to live a life that her mother could have only dreamt about. The idea of going to college, going to law school, and then ultimately achieving some of the great heights that she did, becoming a Supreme Court justice and fighting for the cause of justice prior to that.
Do you see a connection between growing up in Brooklyn, in New York, with the justice she became? I mean, this was not a person who came from a place like some places in the Midwest, which are where there are few people of color, few Jews. New York was a polyglot society, and she tried her best, I believe, to represent that multiplicity of cultures and traditions and religions that is the basis of the American society we wish to defend and we wish to espouse.
I would agree. I'd say that her rearing in Brooklyn was instrumental to that idea, like you said, encountering people of different walks of life, different faiths and race and ethnicities, things of that nature. And just even the idea of being around enterprising women, too, I think was something that she found deeply, that were deeply foundational experiences for her, and something you and I have spoken about before, too, is just that her Jewish faith is something that also informed much of her worldview and the cause for justice that she so dearly fought for, even into her last days. These were things that helped to form her into the woman that she became.
There is a quote that comes out of Jewish tradition that says, only tzaddikim, only holy people passed away or died on Rosh Hashanah. And she passed away the first night of the Jewish New Year. Many of us who were either Zooming into synagogue services or at our homes took note of that, not irony, but in a way, it added to her luster that she passed away on one of the most holy days of the Jewish calendar. And the theme of justice runs all through this particular period in the Jewish calendar. The theme of redemption and forgiveness and justice are the central themes of Rosh Hashanah and the fast day of Yom Kippur. So while she was not a Orthodox Jew, she was certainly informed by Jewish culture and the struggle of Jews to participate in the movements for social justice that have been a part of the United States history from early on. Abolitionist movement, civil rights movement, environmental movement, and one of the things most important to Ruth, of course, was the movement for women's equality. And if you could talk about some of the first things that she did that are notable, the first professor, for instance, at Columbia.
Yeah, so Justice Ginsburg was a trailblazer at all points, and she, in her own personal life, put forth figurative cracks in the glass ceiling that many of us lament in terms of preventing women from advancing in the working world, whether it's just the idea of her going to college when she went to Cornell, and then subsequently going to Columbia for law school. She was a joint valedictorian of her class. And then from there, she had difficulty actually entering into the legal field. So she was denied a clerkship because she was a woman. And
where was that?
She was, the name is escaping me. I should know this. But she was denied her first clerkship because she was a woman. And from there, she began a career in academia. She was a professor at Rutgers Law. As you mentioned, she was the first woman professor there. And at the time that she was a professor at Rutgers Law, she was one of less than 20 women in the entire country who were teaching at law school. So she was a trailblazer in that regard. And at each point in her career, she was forging paths forward. She ultimately got her first federal appointment under Jimmy Carter with Judge Palmieri, and from there she served valiantly. She served valiantly for 2 years, and at the time there was still even reluctance to bring her on as a clerk, again because she was a woman. But the dean of Columbia's law school not only vouched for her, but went as far as to say that he would not recommend anyone else to this judge if he did not give Justice Ginsburg an opportunity, to which he ultimately did. And beyond that, he even went as far as to say, if for some reason, God forbid, she did not succeed, he would send another recommendation for someone. But Justice Ginsburg obviously succeeded she did remarkably well, and from there went on to do remarkable things. One of the things that she was also heralded for was her work with the ACLU and fighting and combating gender discrimination.
And could you talk about some of the cases
Yes.
that she argued that before the Supreme Court, which is sort of a historical irony that she was
Yes.
defending cases of women long before she actually got to the court?
Yeah, and yes, and that's one thing that Justice Ginsburg was brilliant for. Not only was she a great advocate, but she was great in strategizing ways to unravel gender discrimination. And one of the things that she did was not just representing women who have been discriminated against, but she also was instrumental in the idea of disarming these gender norms that were forming in our society. One case in particular, there was a widower whose wife passed away during childbirth, and he wanted to spend less time at work and be able to raise his young son in the wake of his wife's passing. And one of the only ways he could do that was to receive Social Security benefits from his wife, who had passed. And he was denied that because the law at the time was designating widows to receive Social Security benefits from a deceased spouse. And so what Justice Ginsburg was identifying was this idea might have benefited women in the moment, but it was presupposing certain gender norms and ideals within society. And to get women and men to be viewed on equal footing, one of the things that she needed to do was to unravel cases like this or laws like this. And so she argued that case before the Supreme Court, and she was successful. And so not only did it mean equality for this gentleman, but it also was able to help eradicate some of these forms of gender discriminations and social hierarchies that we see both in law and policy.
And another case was the Virginia Military Institute that had a male-only admissions policy, and she challenged that and won.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this was, again, a key victory for Justice Ginsburg in that she's able to afford opportunities for women in roles that were traditionally viewed as men's roles. And so with this particular case, the idea, at least in the framing of society at the time, was that men participate in active service in the military, and that's not a job that was fitting or suitable for a woman. And as a consequence, you have places like this institute in Virginia that was denying admissions to women. And what Justice Ginsburg was able to do was to help to successfully argue for admission of women. And so these types of strategic cases were means in which to help tackle these longer structural imbalances, and in very similar ways mirrored what the late Thurgood Marshall was doing with race discrimination. Thurgood Marshall was also had a very deliberate and systematic approach in terms of the types of cases that were brought before the Supreme Court, until ultimately you get this culminating case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that unravels Jim Crow. But the groundwork had been laid previously. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you if you saw any similarities between the careers of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and of Thurgood Marshall, and how they both represented their two communities, but started, or in the early part of their legal careers, both of them argued cases before the Supreme Court.
Yes, and so that in many ways is a perfect parallel between the two. Justice Marshall argued dozens of cases before the Supreme Court, before he ultimately became Solicitor General, and then from there was promoted to the Supreme Court bench. Justice Ginsburg, very similarly, was routinely arguing cases before the Supreme Court and or writing amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, to help to lay the groundwork and legal support for arguments in favor of ending gender discrimination before she ultimately gets on the bench as well. And so in that way, there are definite parallels between the two.
As a human being, she seemed to be exceedingly well liked. One of the wonderful stories about her, which on first blush, I must admit to not quite understanding, is that one of her favorite justices on the court was Scalia.
Yes, they were friends and colleagues, and they had a shared sense of tenacity and also just principled ways of life. I think that they admired in each other in terms of also they respected the intellect of the other as well. And then too, they were colleagues on the U.S. District Court before being elevated to the Supreme Court too. So they had a long-standing professional relationship. And I would venture to say this relationship that she had with Justice Scalia was emblematic of the ways in which she endeared herself to people. And I also think it's emblematic of how our society has polarized significantly in the time since both of their passings, or since they were both first arriving to the Supreme Court together. Just to think about at the time at which Justice Ginsburg was nominated to the Supreme Court, she was viewed as a moderate. And Republicans like Senator Orrin Hatch even recommended that she be a Supreme Court justice because she was viewed as a moderate. And so we obviously view her legacy differently now, but I think part of that is because we've become so polarized. But her friendship with the late Justice Scalia, I believe, is just emblematic of the less acrimony and the imposing size at the time, and just also that she seemed to be a very pleasant person to be around.
Could as an example of that, could you talk about her collar and how, do you know the story about that?
Yeah, so that's actually a great way, again, that she was advocating for the rights and just the representation of women. And so the collar that she wore on the bench was signifying, again, just a woman's place here can also be the Supreme Court bench, the highest court in the land. And so while the rest of her colleagues were wearing these robes, she's adding to it the collar that she was so known for and later beloved for and wearing.
And on the subject of polarization of the political discourse in our country at the moment, how do you see the events of the last 24, 48 hours unfolding? How are both parties reacting to her death? And there's a column today in the New York Times which argued that the Democrats were largely responsible for the polarization because of what they did to Bork.
That is a common refrain that's offered in these types of conversations, in part because prior to the failed nomination of Judge Bork, most judicial hearings did not receive much press, but that is disingenuous to speak about the current moment and laying it at the feet of Democrats for something that happened almost 40 years ago. Particularly when we can point to a direct comparison within the last 4 years. Judge Merrick Garland should be a Supreme Court justice. A sitting president with legitimate power nominated him to the Supreme Court, and if the Republicans did not agree that he was fit to sit on the Supreme Court, he was at least entitled to a confirmation hearing and an up and down vote in the Senate. And as we all know, he was infamously denied that. For those who might be a little unfamiliar with the process, the Constitution lays out the ways in which we get Supreme Court justices. The power is vested in the president to nominate a Supreme Court justice upon what is called advice and consent of the Senate, meaning that the Senate has the ability to confirm or deny a presidential nominee. And in recent history, most presidents have received their nominee appointed to the bench. One of the last nominees who didn't make it was President George W. Bush nominated Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court. She was not confirmed, but she had no experience as a judge. But this current moment, I guess to answer your question more succinctly, is a demonstration of the intellectual dishonesty from some of the sitting Republicans, some of the naked pursuit of power, and just this zero-sum game of accumulating and maintaining power. The Republicans invented a precedent to keep Merrick Garland off the bench 4 years ago, and many of them even went as far as to say that if Hillary Clinton were the president, if she had won the election in 2016, they would have held that seat open for the entirety of her presidency. Senator Cruz said that himself. And now he's lamenting the idea that we might go into a contested election with a 4-4 ideological balance on the Supreme Court, when that's exactly the scenario he helped to create. And now many of these same senators are saying that we not only should put a replacement for Justice Ginsburg on the bench, but we should do so with significantly less time. The election is less than 50 days away. And the idea that there would be an attempt to fill a seat in that window of time is an outrageous deviation from the norms and ideals that have been set forth up to this point, and it's a direct contradiction of what so many people have said that they have espoused over the course of the last several years or so.
One way we should talk about strategies of responding to the Republican Party and all those who would use Ginsburg's passing to advance their own political agenda and their own sense of power, which is a wonderful time to remind everyone of the importance of voting. It's been historically important all through American history, and yet somehow this year, because of the Trump administration, because of COVID, because of civil unrest in the streets following police shootings of unarmed African-American men, mostly. And we can't emphasize this enough. If you are not registered, please go register. If you are registered, there are at least 3 different ways of voting. And the future of the country, if not the world, the future of our children's generation depends upon what all of us do between now and Election Day.
Indeed, elections have consequences, and one of the consequences of a presidential election is that the president has an opportunity to select a Supreme Court justice. And if a Supreme Court justice were an independent arbiter of law that we say that they are, and did not have ideological principles that guided them, it wouldn't matter who nominated them. So long as a person were qualified, we would be fine with that. But we have all this hand-wringing every 4 years because we know that Supreme Court justices are people, and that these people have worldviews and biases and prejudices that inform their decision-making. But aside from national elections, all elections are important. If we are concerned about things that are happening in our community, we need to concern ourselves with who we are voting for, or who we have an opportunity to vote for, not just in a national election. And national elections always get the attention, but the president is not the only person who's on the ballot in November. And so I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I would encourage all of our listeners to educate themselves on issues that are important to them and see which candidates best align with these various ideals that they hold, what things are on their local ballots, and how they can be informed going into their polling place in November, or if they mail in a ballot prior to them.
Let's remember some of the important cases that Justice Ginsburg was part of that are particularly important for the American Muslim community. One was, of course, Abercrombie and Fitch v. EEOC. If you could talk about that case and its importance.
That's a very important case, and we often have evoked to the holding of that case, and it's effectively ensuring that prospective employers cannot engage in discrimination. So you as a American citizen or resident of the United States have rights, privileges, and immunities that are protected by the Constitution, and one of those is that you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of your religion. And so one of the places where that can happen most often is in employment, and there are federal laws in place that prohibit religious discrimination. They prevent religious discrimination in employment, but that didn't necessarily mitigate what was happening with prospective employers. What happens if I go in for a job interview and the person learns about my faith? Can they discriminate against me? Or what happens if a woman is hijabi and she goes into an interview and a prospective employer discriminates against her because of that? This case adds prospective employers into these larger protections. So you can't be discriminated against by someone who currently employs you or someone who is considering employing you. And that type of religious protection goes a long way in helping to secure the rights and privileges of Muslim Americans, but all Americans. As we mentioned before, President Clinton said that Justice Ginsburg helped to make America a more perfect union, and that's a great example of that.
Another case where she participated and voted against, I believe the majority, was the travel ban cases, the so-called Muslim travel ban. And she felt this was such an example of anti-Muslim prejudice, of Islamophobia, of open racism, that she, in a way, broke tradition and criticized Trump's remarks during the 2016 campaign.
Yes. That was remarkable that she did that, but it was fitting that she did, because prior to the president enacting that policy, he announced the motivations behind it. And so many of the legal counsel who brought cases or brought suit against the Trump administration for that, whether it be a friend of the court briefs or it's these direct filings, they all were referencing these remarks that President Trump made publicly, because he very clearly stated what is considered religious animus and bias and prejudice. And Justice Ginsburg was right in addressing that, because it's very rare that a sitting public official would so clearly reveal the presence of bias and prejudice and enacting a wide sweeping policy. But that's what happened here, and she was not afraid to call it out for what it was.
One can only put ourselves in her place, and she was clearly in great pain, and was very ill the last decade or so of her life, and yet continued with unbelievable fortitude and courage to sit on the bench, to hear cases, to respond with questions, to write opinions. And it's a remarkable life of courage that she bequeathed to us.
Absolutely. Justice Ginsburg literally fought for the rights of marginalized people until the very end. Many people in her circumstances would have opted to have taken another course, to maybe retire or to maybe take a reduced caseload, which is not necessarily feasible for some justices, but at least some people would have considered that. But Justice Ginsburg, literally to her dying days, was on the court fighting. And in that way, she was, again, continuing the tradition of titans who have passed even this year, whether you're looking at Representative Elijah Cummings, who was signing subpoenas from his hospital bed, or if you look at the late John Lewis, who Edmund Pettus Bridge while fighting stage 4 cancer. she is a part of this generation that was fighting to make America hold dear to the promises that it's made and make it keep the promises that it's made. And she was doing that as a Supreme Court justice fighting to the very end.
And how did the African American community, what did they, any instances come to mind of her importance to the Black community? Any statements that you know of where she commented upon police brutality?
Generally speaking, there has just been a deep sense of reverence for Justice Ginsburg among all Americans. Well, I won't say all Americans, but many Americans. She was an icon in terms of some of these rights that she fought for. And so what I have witnessed is a lament with her passing because of what it potentially means in terms of the ideological shift that could happen on the Supreme Court and the erosion of rights, and just how quickly that can happen. By way of example, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and we are now seeing Jim Crow levels of voting suppression happening in states like Georgia and North Carolina and Illinois. And so, Wisconsin and Texas. And so, in that way, there was a great lament about how quickly some of these rights that are precious and vigorously fought for can be erased, because one of the few people on the Supreme Court that can be deemed to be dependable to protect these rights is now gone.
You know, those of us who grew up during the 1960s and saw the victories of the civil rights movement, and heard LBJ in the White House say, "We shall overcome," with Dr. King standing next to him. It's to see that unroll, and that to have history move backwards a half century later. For those who marched in the South and who were attacked, it must feel terribly sad, and a ungluing of the bonds that held this country together, to see every piece of social legislation, progressive social legislation, attacked by the current regime. This is a sad time in American history.
It is a sad time in American history, but it's not a unique time in American history. Every moment of American history that saw sweeping and progressive change has been met with a regression. So we ostensibly end slavery with the end of the Civil War in 1865. We have Reconstruction for 12 years, and then we get the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and the lynching era. We get the civil rights era of the 40s through the 50s and receive unprecedented legislation in Supreme Court cases. And then with that follows COINTELPRO, the war on drugs, mass incarceration. So this notion of this larger regression to a more restrictive society is not new. And so for those who feel dejected, what I often tell them is that you are not the first to take up this fight. There are people who came before you, who fought to see a better day that they themselves may not have seen, and that it is incumbent upon us who believe in the goodwill and the idea of a more perfect union to fight to make it so, even if we don't see it ourselves. There are people who fought to end slavery who did not see the end of slavery. There are people who fought to see the end of Jim Crow who did not see the end of Jim Crow. There are people who are now fighting to see the end of some of these isms and stigmas that are in our society right now who may not see the end of them. Some of those are people we just named, like the late Justice Ginsburg, Elijah Cummings, and the late John Lewis. But we owe it to them and ourselves to continue pushing, as dejected as we may feel, to press towards a brighter future, one that we can be proud of, one that is inclusive of all of us.
Amen. And yet we face a determined enemy
Yes.
We were talking today, and you were talking about the long-term plan of the alt-right, of the right wing, to take over the judiciary.
Mhm.
And if you could talk about what the Trump administration has been doing to the lower level court systems as well.
That is actually, I would say, one of the most understated legacies of the Trump administration, and probably the most long lasting. Federal judges have lifelong appointments. So the only way you can remove a federal judge is by their own retirement, their own death, or via impeachment. And so as a consequence, when you appoint someone to a federal bench, whether it's the Supreme Court, a appellate court, or a federal district court, this person conceivably can alter the shape of the law for decades. And so President Trump, in the span of 3.5 years, has appointed, and the Senate has confirmed, over 200 federal judges. By way of example, just by comparison, President Obama in the last 4 years of his presidency was only able to get 8 federal judges appointed. President Trump got 8 on the Friday before last confirmed. Mitch McConnell has had a long-term plan of how and when to affect change and to secure the agenda that he has in place. And so by planning, what I mean by that is the night before President Obama's inauguration, Newt Gingrich convened a number of prominent Republicans in Washington, many of whom had personal grievances with each other, but they all attested to the idea that they grossly miscalculated the moment and that they could not let Obama be a successful president. And so they wanted to do everything that they could to make him a one-term president. They did not succeed in that regard, but one of the things that they wanted to do was take control of the courts. And so with that, President Trump, like I said, has had more than 200 federal judges nominated and confirmed in the Senate. And this isn't just a matter of, well, you know, some of these people are qualified and maybe just have ideological differences. Some of these people have never tried a case to verdict, have never led a deposition, are admittedly unfamiliar with the rules of civil procedure, are admittedly unfamiliar with the rules of criminal procedure. Most infamously, Matthew Spencer Peterson was in a confirmation hearing. He was in his early 30s. He was nominated by President Trump to be a federal judge. And when questioned about these things, he said as much. He'd never tried a case to verdict. He had never led a deposition. He was not familiar with recent updates in the federal rules of civil procedures. And he was about to get the promotion of a lifetime. An appointment to a federal judgeship was long considered the linchpin of a pristine and sterling legal career. It was reserved for the best of the best jurists, regardless of ideological positioning. What one could consider up until this current era is if you were nominated to hold a federal judgeship, you had sterling credentials, you had excellent experience, and no one questioned your qualifications. Right now, with President Trump and Mitch McConnell, the only qualification is ideological consistency. Do you agree with my worldview? And that could have disastrous effects for the rights of marginalized people if these are people who agree with the worldview that President Trump has espoused in his time as a public figure, but particularly as a president. And so this is one of the things that should concern many people, but few people talk about when you consider how many people are being pushed through. I mean, Mitch McConnell is delaying updates to the stimulus package, to voting rights, to anti-lynching legislation, but he's pushing through judges anytime he gets an opportunity to. And that should tell us something. Most of our attention is focused on if and when they might replace Justice Ginsburg, but we should also be focusing on some of these lower court judges too, because marginalized people have often in the United States had to look to the courts as a last resort. If I can't get justice in my community, if the local authorities won't give me justice, if I'm discriminated against, if I'm harmed, the courts will make it right by honoring the laws that are on paper. And if there are people in the courts who are sitting on the bench who are not committed to the preservation of the rights of all people, we can quickly see an erosion of these hard-fought and protected rights.
And in what areas, in what legal areas could be impacted the most egregiously
Um,
by these lower court judges?
I think some of the most egregious, um, I guess, protections that we can see taken away are voting protections, basic civil rights and liberties protections. So discrimination on the basis of race, gender, ethnicity, national origin. If you have someone who believes that these are not things that are at issue right now, they could very easily do what was done to the Voting Rights Act in 2013. The Roberts Court basically said racism is over. So we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. And that's why they gutted the Voting Rights Act. And if you continue to put people on the bench who hold that idea in place, then we can quickly see some of these rights taken away. Many people are also fearing the erasure of reproductive rights and autonomy for women, because many of the people that President Trump has nominated have vowed to, or at least have vowed to end Roe versus Wade or overturn Roe versus Wade. We don't know if that will happen. That is a legitimate fear among people. But these are some of the rights that people are afraid are hanging in the balance. You mentioned police brutality earlier today. The Supreme Court in 1985 said that a police officer cannot shoot someone in the back. You cannot use lethal force to shoot a fleeing suspect. But that's still happening right now. Antoine Rose was shot and killed in this state running away from a police officer. Walter Scott was shot and killed in South Carolina, running away from a police officer. And it's a fight to even get some of these officers charged on laws that are clearly on the book. And so if you have justices, again, on the court who don't believe that this is an issue or want to advance things like qualified immunity, we might see these things continue to, we might see some of these injustices continue.
Much to think about and contemplate and to plan for. Do we have any questions out there? Do we know?
I have not seen any questions, but we do have about 10 minutes or so before we need to begin concluding if we did have questions. But while you look for questions, one thing I will say is that people are wondering what can be done. If what has been discussed tonight is something that is a concern to me, what can I do about this? So one of the things that can be done is first ensuring that you are registered to vote and you have a plan to vote, because now more than ever, you not only need to ensure that you're registered, but that you have a plan in place to secure that you can vote. We talked about the idea of not just being knowledgeable about national elections, but local elections. That has the most direct impact on your day-to-day life. So we need to be prepared for that. Additionally, if you are concerned about the prospects of ramming through a nomination and confirmation to replace Justice Ginsburg, you should call your senator. Call both of them and tell them that you oppose that. Some people will say that might not make any difference, but you can at least go on record as saying that I oppose what is happening right now. And then two, we can push people who are currently elected officials to consider different strategies to mitigate the harm that's happening. So the three main strategies that have been toyed about are expanding the number of Supreme Court justices, to end the filibuster, and to also expand the number of federal judges across the country. So all of these confirmations that have been pushed through over the past 3.5 years, you could potentially mitigate them by counterbalancing them with other justices. And so those are all things that people have put on the table. Those are colloquially called the nuclear options. I think that's a terrible name for it, but that's what people have suggested. I think there's some merit to those ideas. And that's something we could potentially talk about. But
speaking of a election that had a beneficial impact, we are joined by CAIR's, Philadelphia CAIR's new president, Mohammed Zabaru, who has taken over from the long-serving Osama al-Qasim. So, Mohammed, welcome to you.
Well, thank you. I've been listening to the wonderful conversation that that you guys have been having, and I always want to take the opportunity to thank you guys for the hard work that you do, and you know, for diligently doing it every day. You know, if there was anything that I picked up from the from the discussion today, it's really that you know, democracy really is an active endeavor.
yes,
And although the activist organizations like CAIR, who are trying to protect civil rights, you know, are fighting the fight, it's ultimately up to the citizens, you know, to get out there, vote, participate in the democracy. Democracy is a participatory sport, and you know, we always have to be vigilant. You know, the big shocks like the death of Justice Ginsburg is not where the regular erosion happens. You know, Timothy was talking about the federal courtships, judgeships that were filled over the last administration. You know, making sure that people get out and vote and make their point of view known and don't get complacent is really how we ensure that, you know, when something like this does happen, like the death of the justice, we've already laid the groundwork as citizens that will ensure an outcome that is to the benefit of the populace. You know, there's not much that can be done now about this particular situation, but what we can do is we can remedy what happens in the future. And so thank you guys so much for all the work that you do on a daily basis. Thank you for the enlightening conversation. And you know, I would urge those who are watching to support us and to support the work that you guys do on a daily basis. You know, it's again, condolences to the family of the justice,
yes.
and for all of those who are, you know, people of progress and peace. And I just kind of wanted to wrap up with that. It looks like there might be a question.
There is a question. The question was, are there checks and balances to a Supreme Court justice? The short answer is there are not many. So the Supreme Court justices are supposed to offer checks and balances to the legislature and to the executive. So their check is that the president nominates them and that the Senate gets to confirm them. So these two opposing sides potentially are supposed to agree on their appointment. Aside from that, you can only remove a federal judge via impeachment, their death, or retirement. It's very rare to, as you see, the impeachment process is very rare. It does happen at the federal level sometimes, but the judge has to typically engage in a level of criminal behavior that is so egregious that that impeachment seems like the only option. And so, again, that's very rare. I think it's happened maybe 16 times in the last 20 or 30 years at the federal level, and that's talking about hundreds of judges over, if not thousands, over that span of time.
I've heard suggestions that the court should be enlarged to counterbalance Republicans. FDR tried that. It didn't quite work in the beginning years of the New Deal. What is your feeling on that? Do you think it would work now to counterbalance Mitch McConnell's machinations to stack the courts?
So I think it absolutely can counterbalance it, because right now, if you confirm a successor for Justice Ginsburg, you have 9 again, you add another justice or 2, you counterbalance that confirmation. So it can be done. Congress has the authority to do that. The reason why people call things like that the nuclear option is because of what the potential of what happens after that. What's to stop another presidential administration from doing a similar thing if they feel as though they are outnumbered on the Supreme Court. So let's say we get Joe Biden as president, we get a Democratic majority, we expand the courts, you add 2 seats. What happens if 20 years from now, Republicans want to do the same thing? And so that's the fear that people have. But at this juncture, I don't know if there's any other option left in terms of trying to counterbalance what's happening, because there are operatives in the Republican Party who have demonstrated an unwillingness to heed norms and precedents, some of which they have established themselves. And the level of influence that they're seeking to have is something that can outlive all of us. Some of these laws and precedents that can be set could be things that are on the books well after any of us are still here. So the short answer is, I think that that's something that senators should absolutely consider if there is a blue wave, so to speak, in November. And I think that that's something that should be presented now as a countermeasure, just to know that if you ran through a nomination and confirmation in less than 50 days, we will expand the court and go from there. But it could set a precedent that could be difficult to undo later.
Does the Constitution mandate how many justices on the Supreme Court?
It does not. So the Constitution creates the Supreme Court with Article 2, and it gives Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the authority to create the structure for the federal court system. That's why we have a federal appellate court and a federal district court, and that has been deemed sufficient authority to give the Judicial Act in the past that has given the number of Supreme Court justices and things like that. So with that said, Congress has the authority to create another judicial seat if they'd like, but the Constitution itself does not give an explicit number.
I think ultimately, again, you know, the ultimate solution rests with the voter, rests with the citizen. And, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us to really be educated about the things that are important to us and the positions of our candidates. And if the politicians that we elect understand that we will hold them to account for whatever it is they do, then they will ultimately be answerable to us. But if not, then, or if we're complacent about our vote, then we get a situation like the one we're in now.
I completely agree. If you are unafraid of the consequences of your decisions as an elected official, you can operate with impunity, and we're seeing that right now. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be active participants in the democracy if we want to see it around, and there are ways in which we can do that. And some of that may even mean that some of you watching us could be running for office. So I mean, there are many different ways that we all can be involved, but I think it starts with the basic and most sacred right, and that's the right to select who represents us in government.
We're getting close to the end. For my part, I should like to quote from the book of Isaiah from the Bible, which is a section read on Rosh Hashanah, and goes like this. And it's talking about the fast coming up on Yom Kippur and why people should fast, and the words echo in our hearts when we read these lines in the book of Isaiah. No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke, and share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him as you would your own kin. And if you offer your compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then shall your light shine in darkness and your gloom will disappear during the noonday.
Amen. Thank you for that, Jacob. And thank you all who stayed and watched us on a Tuesday night talking about the Supreme Court. Thank you, Muhammad, for your kind words about the work that we do. And thank you for all, again, for, like I said, not just for watching, but for your support. We are here because you support us, and we're able to do things like this because of your generous and gracious support. And so we want to thank you for that. Thank you, Jacob, for your leadership. Thank you, Ahmed, for all of the work that you're doing and helping us facilitate this behind the scenes. And we hope that you all go forth and are active participants in democracy. And in the meantime, that you enjoy your evening.
Amen.
Thank you so much, everyone. And salamu alaikum. And again, please support the work that CAIR-Philadelphia does. You know, it's an awesome staff that's working very, very diligently on your behalf.
Good night, everyone. See you on Election Day.
Yes.
Vote.